The app economy is an example of how technology defines the business model. The more you understand how that interaction between tech and business really works, the more you will understand how the world works today, and that in turn will make you more insightful and more successful. Welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm your host, tech entrepreneur, executive coach, and Chicago Booth MBA, Sophia Matveeva. My aim here is to help you have a great career in the digital age. In a time when even your coffee shop has an app, you simply have to speak tech. On this podcast, I share core technology concepts, help you relate them to business outcomes, and most importantly, share practical advice on what you can do to become a digital leader today. If you want to have a great career in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Hello, smart people. How are you today? I am back to London where the weather is predictably awful, but I did something I really liked this week. Earlier on this week, I taught my last class of 2023, and it was called Design Thinking for Career and Venture Growth. And I love teaching you, so I had a really great time. As you already know, I'm a huge proponent of design thinking because you can use it for business management, for product innovation, and for career transitions. And in fact, I have used it for all three. So if you want to learn this core digital innovation skill set, which I highly recommend you do, and if you also want to have a clear plan for next year, then join the Design for Growth program that starts in January. Design thinking is the strength behind the successes of companies like Airbnb and Snap and Logitech, as you heard in a recent podcast episode. And this is why I really want you to learn it, and I want you to apply design thinking to whatever goals you're working toward. In the Design for Growth program, you will learn core design thinking concepts, and you will also get to learn from a guest speaker. So there's going to be me, and there is going to be a guest speaker who is a lead designer in a company. So she works on design innovation for products, and she also uses design thinking to basically work with the CEO. And this is why I love this program, because you'll have a session with a real practitioner and get to ask us both your questions and get feedback from us. And in the second half of this program, you will apply what you've learned to your goals for 2024. So whether you have a goal for growing a business, for growing a division in a business, or maybe you want to launch a product, or you want to have a career glow up, then this is definitely for you. And if you haven't got your ticket yet, well, there is still time for early bird rates. But early bird pricing expires at the end of December. So make sure that you join Design for Growth before the end of the month. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, and if you've been getting value from these episodes, then you are going to love taking a deeper dive into the concepts that you've been learning here and actively participating. Because I know you can learn a lot from listening to podcasts, but I also know that you get just so much more from being in a class and getting feedback on your work and being there with other students. So join us before the early bird rate runs out. Go to techfornontechies.co/events or join via the link in the show notes. In today's lesson, you're going to learn about the app economy, which is a fascinating phenomenon. Just think about how apps have changed your life. They have changed how you communicate. They may have changed how you date, how you travel, how you entertain yourself. And also they have brought podcasts into your ears. So huge changes, and changes that we like, right? The app economy is worth about $500 billion today. So it's not small. And it didn't even exist before 2007, which I think is insane. And look at this value creation, $500 billion just since 2007. The importance of the app economy and how it has transformed business and how it has transformed our lives, it just cannot be overestimated. And this importance and this value is set to grow. Listen to this. According to Statista, the total revenue in the app market is expected to show an annual growth rate of 9.59% in the next 4 years. So let's just say about 9.5%. Now let's contrast that 9.5% projected growth with the projected growth of the US economy, which is 2.4% today, and the UK, which is an abysmal 0.5% growth. The app economy is about 9.6. My point is, if you want to be in a rapidly growing market, the app economy is where it's at. And this is why I want to teach you this lesson today. Today's episode is especially relevant for innovators, so basically founders and corporate innovators. It's also relevant for investors because you guys are funding innovation. And also it's important for people who support the innovation economy. Because this part of the economy is set to grow, it's a huge opportunity for professional services providers like lawyers and accountants and bankers and marketers and so on. Because if you're in professional services, the more you understand your clients, the more you're likely to get new business, right? So if you have friends who work in professional services, so maybe they're a partner in a law firm or they're an investment banker, send them this episode because it could really help them do better at work. Okay, now let's think about the apps that you use most. So for me, these are Gmail and WhatsApp and Instagram on a daily basis, and then Uber and Google Maps when I need to go somewhere, and also actually Headspace. I use that every morning. And out of all of these, all but the Google apps came out on the iPhone first. And this makes sense because Google has its own ecosystem and they're a rival to Apple. Today I'm going to show you why the apps that you're probably using most have come out on Apple first, and then you're going to understand how the Apple ecosystem differs from the Google ecosystem on Android, and then you're going to see how this affects the business models of apps. And those business models affect basically what you get on your phone first, which affects your user experience, which is why I think this whole thing is really, really interesting, and which is why I think you will enjoy this episode. So first, let's think about these two ecosystems. The first thing that I want you to see is that an app ecosystem consists of two parts. It's the hardware and the software, which means your phone, that's the actual object that you're holding in your hand, that's the hardware, and then the software, that's the other part, and that's all of the apps on your phone. The Apple system refers only to iPhones, which run on iOS, and that's the software that Apple created. If you want to launch an app on the iPhone, it has to be compliant with the iOS system. Android system refers to all sorts of phones, from the Samsung Galaxy, which is quite expensive, to everything else that is basically not the iPhone. So everything from really expensive phones to really cheap phones. There's a huge variety. The operating system on Android is the software, the Android software created by Google. So you already see the difference. In the Apple ecosystem, we have one player, just one player. Apple controls everything. They make the hardware and they make the iOS software. In the Android ecosystem, you have many players. You have lots of companies that make the hardware, i.e. the phones, and they're united by one major player, which is Google, which makes the Android software. And also what I want you to see here is that Apple is a luxury brand, and control is super important for luxury brands in general. So let's look at Louis Vuitton or let's look at Krug Champagne. These companies barely outsource anything. In fact, I'm not sure if they actually outsource anything at all. These companies, they're responsible for the production. So from dyeing the leather for the bags, to growing their own grapes for the champagne, to the manufacturing. And then they do their own marketing and then their own sales. For luxury brands, control is really, really important. Look at the way Hermès sells their bags. You're not going to see Hermès bags being sold next to other bags, even within a retail store. So control is super important for luxury, and control costs money. So let's see how this plays out in the Apple ecosystem. Think about the Apple ecosystem like a high-end department store. So basically like Neiman Marcus in New York, or Harrods in London, or Galeries Lafayette in Paris. When you go into one of these department stores, you see that they've got their own aesthetic and they've got their own rules. They're super selective about whom they allow to sell there. And they've also got rules about how items need to be displayed. You are not going to walk into Neiman Marcus and you're not going to see a huge pile of clothes just lying there in a mess. Like that just wouldn't happen. And so let's see how this translates to the Apple ecosystem. If you want to make an app for the Apple App Store, which actually I have done in my previous company, then that app has to be coded in a programming language that is only compatible with Apple. So in effect, it's custom made for Apple, which is why you have to make that choice. There is now a software that can release on both, which we don't want to go into today. But essentially, in general, if you want to release on Apple, you want to use a code called Swift, which is a code just for the Apple ecosystem. Also, when you release on Apple, you have to make sure that your app looks good on iPhones. And, iPhones, they come in different sizes. And like a luxury brand, Apple is very, very concerned with how things look in their store. So they have design guidelines for your app. And if you don't want to follow those guidelines, then, Apple is just not going to let you in. So it's your app and their guidelines. You see, there's this element of control. So if you have decided that actually I'm still going to release on Apple, you will have to submit your app to the Apple team for review. And the app has to be in that Apple compliant language, the coding language I mentioned called Swift. And also the design, so the actual screens, the way the app looks, the way the app interacts, that has to be compliant with Apple guidelines too. And despite all of your compliance, Apple could still say no. They could still reject you. So even after you've done all of that work, which costs money, they could still reject you. But if you are funding innovation or you want to release apps, don't let this freak you out, because in my experience, which is quite extensive in this field, in my experience, if you follow Apple's guidelines, they rarely say no forever. What often happens is that they will reject your first submission and then they'll send you notes on what you need to change. And then basically you change that and then you resubmit and then everything's fine. But what I want you to see here is that there is real control. It's like editorial control, or like the control of a buyer in a luxury store. Because Apple is really, really particular. It does not want ugly crap. It does not want scam apps in their ecosystem that are basically going to defraud people. And now let's go back to our luxury retail analogy. You know how in luxury department stores, there are stores within stores. So there'll be like a boutique within a store. So for example, in Selfridges in London, there is a Chanel boutique. The Chanel boutique is like a mini Chanel store with their own aesthetic and staff hired by Chanel, not by Selfridges. And this shows that there is a tension between the power dynamic. The retailer and the brand, they need each other, but they also have their own views on aesthetics, and they definitely have views on how their partnership should be priced. This kind of power dynamic also plays out between very popular app developers and Apple. So look at the lawsuit between Epic Games and Apple, or the battle that Mark Zuckerberg has been having about privacy with Apple's Tim Cook. That is a whole other can of worms, and if we went into proper detail about this today, this would not be a podcast episode, this would be an audiobook. But my point is that the luxury retail environment is basically really similar to the app ecosystem at Apple, but not at Android. And this is really, really important. Okay, now that we've got that covered, let's look at the business models. Who shops in luxury stores? I mean, this is obvious. Rich people shop in luxury stores. People who have money to spend, because stuff in luxury stores is expensive. And this translates to Apple. The median iPhone user earns $85,000 per year, which is 40% more than the median Android user, who has an income of $61,000, and that's according to Comscore. So a 40% difference, pretty huge. So how do you think this affects the business model of the apps on the iPhone versus the apps on Android? Well, if you are listening to this on the iPhone, then I invite you to think about how many app subscriptions you have. I mean, for me, I have loads. So I pay for Apple Music, I pay for Headspace, I pay for various health apps and various productivity kind of work apps. And you know what? I love them. I use them and I am happy to pay for things that bring me value. On Apple, in general, apps monetize via subscription. This means that on Apple, users pay to use the apps that they're using. And just like for luxury brands, The apps on the Apple ecosystem do not need everybody to buy their product to be really successful. So Headspace or Calm or Duolingo, they don't actually need every single person to buy the subscription to be successful businesses. Now let's look at the Android ecosystem. The Android system does not have the same level of control. It is not a luxury environment, so it does not have the same checks and balances. Think about it more like a street market instead of a luxury store, and not the kind of farmer's market that only caters to rich people. You know exactly what I mean. So if you submit your app to the Android system, it will not be vigorously checked like it will be on Apple. And that's basically why there are so many more dodgy apps that are out to scam you on Android. Android is this mass market environment, and this means that more people use the Android ecosystem. So there are more users, there are many, many more people around the world using Android than Apple. Because Android is a mass market environment, the users tend to be more price sensitive, and the business model has to reflect that. So most people in the Android ecosystem would not pay for app subscriptions. Like, they just don't have that disposable income to spend. But, app developers, they do have to make money somehow. So what do? Well, they sell advertising. On Android, the vast majority of apps monetize via advertising, not via subscription. So to sum up, Apple apps generally monetize via subscription. Android apps generally monetize via advertising. And what do you need for effective advertising? You already know this. You need a lot of information about your users, because you need to know, okay, who are these people? What do they like? What are they into? So you can serve them the best advert. So you need to collect lots and lots of data. And this is why Android and Apple have such a different attitude to collecting your data. So you might have seen these adverts from Apple when they're literally advertising the fact that they keep your information private. So literally they're advertising privacy as a feature of their ecosystem. Privacy is an important differentiator for Apple. And I don't want you to think that it's because, they have some kind of moral higher ground. This is literally driven by the business models of the apps in their ecosystem. It's the subscription model. For the subscription model, you do not need to have the same amount of data collection as you do for an advertising model. So I want you to see that there's this difference in business models. So subscription on Apple and advertising on Android. And this difference is driven by the way the ecosystems are set up, and also by the actual hardware, right? So on Apple, you have these expensive phones. On Android, you have expensive phones, but you have a whole range of inexpensive phones, which means that they are much, much more accessible. And so this difference in the way the ecosystem is set up, and also in the different price ranges of the hardware, that actually influences the way these apps make money. The most premium apps go on Apple, and then Apple basically gets more and more luxurious, so it becomes this kind of self-perpetuating circle. And Android app developers keep needing more data, so they could sell advertising. So basically, privacy cannot really be a feature on Android. Innovators and investors need to understand whom they are targeting, so then you can understand which ecosystem is the right one. If you're going for higher income users, you will release on Apple first. If you want to grow in middle income countries, maybe like Turkey, for example, you need to release on Android first. So understand your user. And this goes back to design thinking. Design thinking is always about understand your user, and everything stems from that. So this is why I always say, okay, I can teach you all of this stuff about, tech ecosystems, we can talk about tech stacks and so on. But unless you understand design thinking first, unless you knock that out of the park, everything else is basically not going to be as good. This is why I really do encourage you to come to the Design for Growth program that we're doing in January. Or if you work in a corporate, then absolutely contact me and I'll let you know about our design thinking workshops, because they tend to be the most popular and actually they tend to have the best ROI for teams. Okay, where were we? Apple versus Android. I do have a note about social media, because this subscription versus advertising issue that we've been discussing, it obviously doesn't apply to the big tech social media companies like Meta and TikTok, because these companies, they basically make money from advertising. As you know, they make money from advertising on Apple and they make money from advertising on Android. But listen to this. They still make more money on Apple because the Apple audience is wealthier. So the kind of ads that you can serve to the Apple audience, even if you are monetizing by advertising, they are going to be more expensive ads. You can make more money on Apple. So for example, this is why Instagram released on Apple first. And today Uber and Instagram and the popular apps, they're everywhere. They're on Apple, they're on Android. And this makes sense because these companies are now going for full market penetration. But their priority at the start was Apple, because that's where the biggest gains are for apps like these. And when you're starting something new, you have to follow the money. Go after the lowest hanging fruit first and then branch out. So for those of you who are professional services providers, so for those of you who are bankers or lawyers, the more you understand your client's growth strategy, the more useful you can be to them. And basically that's how you get the more interesting, more lucrative and more long-term engagement. For example, an Android app is going to collect more data about its users, as we've just discussed. So if you're a lawyer making privacy policies, you need to understand why this is, because the more you understand about the commercial use case and not just about the actual contract law, the more of a strategic counsel you're going to be. And now, my dear smart person, it is homework time. It's an easy homework. Look at the apps on your phone and think about how they monetize. Now that you understand how the different ecosystems have been set up on Apple versus Android, you can understand how they influence business models, and that will make you more insightful and therefore capable of making better decisions. The app economy, as I told you, it has exploded and it is going to keep on growing almost at 4 times the rate of the US economy. So people, this is a huge business opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for innovators, for investors, and for the service providers in this economy. This is why I really want you to learn about this stuff. If you work in an organization that works with or wants to work with the app economy, and I mean, after this episode, I don't understand why you wouldn't, then let me know and I will send you some information about our most popular workshops on the topic. And also, my dear smart person, just remember that the Design for Growth program starts in January and there is still early bird tickets available if you're listening to this in December 2023. So make sure to get your tickets before the end of December. The link to join the program is in the show notes, or just go to techfornontechies.co/events. Now, my darling, I'm wishing you a wonderful day. Go and enjoy yourself, be happy, eat something delicious, and I will be back in your delightful smart ears next week. Ciao!